Camping in Zimbabwe felt like stepping into another world, vast and untamed. We were young and foolish, eager to explore without truly understanding the risks. It was the late 1980s, and my husband and I were teaching in Lesotho. On holidays, we packed our gear and our baby daughter, who wasn't even a year old, and ventured into the wild. That night, the air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of earth and distant fires. We pitched our small tent in a secluded spot, the dark expanse of the park pressing in around us. It was peaceful, or so we thought, with only the occasional rustle of leaves to break the silence. My daughter lay between us, her small breaths a comforting reminder of the life we had brought into this vast, unforgiving land. Sometime after midnight, the quiet was broken by an unsettling sound, a cough, deep and rough, carried on the wind. I stiffened, listening closely. Then it came again, closer this time, followed by another. My heart began to race as I realized it wasn't just one. There were more, all around us, surrounding the tent. I felt a chill creep up my spine. My daughter, sensing something was amiss, began to make soft noises in her sleep, her tiny whimpers cutting through the night. The coughing sounds outside grew louder, more frequent, as if her noises were drawing them in. We were unarmed, defenseless, with nothing but a thin layer of fabric separating us from whatever was out there. The noise of something sniffing at the base of the tent sent a wave of dread through me. I could hear the soft thud of paws circling, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scratching at the ground, trying to dig under the tent. My daughter's whimpers turned to cries, and my heart pounded in my chest as panic took hold. My husband and I exchanged a terrified glance in the dim light, knowing there was nowhere to run, nothing to fight with. I could feel the ground vibrating beneath us as one of the creatures pressed its snout against the side of the tent, sniffing, almost testing the fabric. It was close, too close. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence, its hunger. My daughter's cries grew louder, more desperate, and I knew we had to do something, anything, to protect her. Without thinking, driven by a primal instinct I didn't know I had, I lashed out. My fist connected with the creature's snout, hard and fast, fueled by pure terror and the desperate need to protect my child. The response was immediate. A high-pitched yelp, almost human in its intensity, filled the air. The creature recoiled, the sound of its retreat followed by the sudden, chaotic scrambling of feet as the others bolted away into the night. For a moment, the world was still again. My hand throbbed where I had struck, but all I could focus on was the quiet. The creatures were gone, leaving nothing behind but the echo of their retreat. I held my daughter close, feeling the tension slowly drain from my body as the reality of what had just happened sank in. My husband and I lay there in stunned silence, our breaths ragged and our hearts pounding, but we were safe. Our daughter was safe. It wasn't until the first light of dawn crept through the tent that we dared to move. We packed up quickly, our hands shaking slightly as we worked. We didn't speak much as we drove away, leaving the park behind. The memory of that night burned into our minds. We were lucky, so incredibly lucky. It wasn't until later that we fully grasped what had happened, that I had punched a hyena in the face, and somehow, miraculously, it had saved us. Even now, years later, I still think about that night, about the terror, the raw, desperate instinct that had surged through me. And I still hear that yelp in my mind, the sound of a creature realizing it had met something far more dangerous than it had anticipated. We never went camping in the wilds of Africa again, but the memory of that night stays with me, a reminder of just how close we came to losing everything, and how, in the end, it was the strength of a mother's love that saved us all. Few years ago, a group of friends and I decided to go camping together. The campground we planned on staying at was full, so we ended up driving deep into the forest, miles away from any other campers. The spot we found was isolated, surrounded by thick trees, with nothing but the sounds of the forest to keep us company. That first night, everything seemed normal until about 2 in the morning. I was jolted awake by the sound of drumming and singing. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, echoing through the stillness of the night. It sounded like traditional Native American music, a rhythmic, haunting melody that felt like it was coming from all around us, not from any specific direction. I lay there, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but no matter how I strained to pinpoint it, the sound seemed to surround us, almost like it was in the air itself. A chill crept down my spine. There was something about the music that felt wrong, like a warning or a bad omen. It wasn't just unsettling, it was terrifying in a way I couldn't fully explain. My instincts were screaming at me that something was off, something beyond the logical. My friends must have felt the same because we all ended up huddling in the car, doors locked, too scared to stay in the tent. The next morning, we were all shaken, but we tried to rationalize it. Maybe there were other campers nearby that we hadn't noticed, though we knew that was unlikely given how remote we were. Still, we decided to explore the area to see if anyone else might be camping nearby, hoping to find some explanation for the sounds. But there was nothing, no tents, no campfires, not even any footprints. The forest was empty, and the only tracks we saw were our own from the night before. The trees were tall and the underbrush thick, but we were in a relatively clear part of the woods, and if anyone had been around, we would have seen them. We tried to shake off the unease, convincing ourselves that it had been nothing more than our imaginations playing tricks on us. So, we stayed another night. That night, I found myself awake again at the same time, just before 2 in the morning. The drumming and singing started once more, but this time, it was louder, closer. The same eerie feeling of wrongness washed over me, stronger than before. The music wasn't just strange, it felt like it didn't belong there, like it was intruding into our world from somewhere else. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I lay there, too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe. I could tell my friends were awake too, though none of us said a word. We were all frozen in our sleeping bags, listening to that unnatural sound that seemed to seep into our bones. The hours dragged by. The music never stopped, never faded. It just kept going, relentless and unnerving. We didn't sleep at all that night, and when the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we were already packing up, desperate to leave. None of us even suggested staying another night. We drove back to the original campground, hoping it would have an open spot, and luckily it did. That night, everything was quiet. There was no drumming, no singing, just the usual sounds of a campsite, crackling fire, rustling leaves, distant conversations. But I couldn't relax. I kept expecting the music to start up again, to hear those drums in the distance, creeping closer. To this day, I don't have an explanation for what we heard out there in the forest. We weren't on tribal land, and there was no sign of anyone else in the area. My best friend, who was one of the campers with us, is Navajo, and she told me later that the music was similar to what she'd heard in tribal dances and rituals. But that only made it more unsettling because there shouldn't have been any such ceremonies happening there, especially not in the middle of the night in an empty forest. Even now, thinking back on it, I get the same feeling of dread I felt that night. It's hard to describe, but my body was telling me that something was very wrong, and I've learned to trust those instincts. Whatever was out there, whatever made that music, wasn't something I ever want to encounter again. I still camp, but I make sure I'm never that far from other people, never that deep into the unknown. Growing up in the Rockies, surrounded by wilderness, my family and I had our fair share of strange experiences. But there's one night that still haunts me, a memory that doesn't fade, no matter how many times I try to make sense of it. My parents owned 35 acres of land deep in the mountains, a secluded spot that felt like our private paradise. We spent as much time as we could camping there, a place where we could roam free, far from the noise of the world. Both of my parents had grown up in these mountains and were experienced campers, so we felt safe, like we belonged there. One summer evening, we decided to head up to the property, arriving later than usual, around 9 or 10 p.m. It was dark, the kind of darkness that swallows everything, leaving only the stars to guide you. We were tired from the drive, eager to set up camp and settle in for the night. The moment we stepped out of the car, though, something felt off. The air was heavy, and there was this strange, almost suffocating silence. Normally, the forest would be alive with sounds, the chirping of insects, the occasional call of an owl, the rustling of leaves. But that night, there was nothing. No hum of life, just an unnatural stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We exchanged uneasy glances, nervous laughter breaking the tension as we started unpacking the car. But deep down, we all felt it, the sensation of being watched, not by one pair of eyes, but by many, from every direction. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, pressing in on us. As we began setting up the tent, the silence was shattered by a strange rustling sound in the trees above us, about 10 feet off the ground. At first, we thought it might be raccoons, but these sounds were different, louder, clumsier, like something large was moving from tree to tree. The branches creaked and groaned under the weight, and the noise grew louder, more frantic, like a chorus of unseen creatures surrounding us. The tension in the air was unbearable. My parents hurried to get the tent up, and once it was ready, they told my brother and me to get inside and stay there. We crawled into our sleeping bags, listening to the chaotic sounds outside, which seemed to grow closer with each passing moment. Suddenly, we heard a series of bizarre calls, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. They weren't animal sounds, not exactly. They had an eerie, almost human quality to them, like someone was imitating the calls of some strange creature, but in a way that was all wrong. The calls echoed from every direction, bouncing off the trees, as if whatever was out there was communicating, responding to one another. My parents went out with flashlights, scanning the trees, trying to find the source of the noise. But no matter where they pointed the light, they saw nothing, no eyes reflecting back at them, no movement in the branches, just the eerie rustling and those chilling calls. My mom's face was pale, her usual confidence shaken. She was the kind of person who would follow a bear just to get a good photo, but now she looked scared, and that terrified me more than anything else. We all huddled together in the tent, our dogs pressed against us, trembling with fear. The sounds outside were relentless, crashing through the trees, almost like a storm was raging just beyond the thin fabric of our shelter. My dad finally decided to go out again, determined to find out what was going on. As he unzipped the tent, the noise stopped. It was like someone flipped a switch, the calls, the rustling, everything just stopped dead. The oppressive feeling that had been suffocating us was gone, leaving behind only an empty silence. My parents ventured out once more, searching the area with their flashlights, but all they found were some broken branches and strange marks high up on the trees, marks that didn't look like anything we could identify. Eventually, they came back to the tent, and after some time, managed to calm us down enough to fall into a restless sleep. The next morning, the forest was back to normal, as if the night before had been nothing but a bad dream. But the memory of that night stayed with us, a mystery we could never solve. We talked about it often, trying to piece together what happened, but none of us could ever explain it. We had seen and heard strange things before, but nothing like that. It was as if the forest itself had come alive, filled with something unknown, something that didn't belong in our world. To this day, I still can't wrap my head around what happened that night. It's a story that lingers in the back of my mind, a reminder that no matter how familiar the woods might seem, there are always things out there we don't understand, things that defy explanation. And sometimes it's better to leave those mysteries unsolved. We were out on the lake, celebrating my younger brother's graduation with a water camping trip. The houseboat was our home for the week, a floating sanctuary on the sprawling, remote lake system. By day, we'd explore the coves and swim in the clear water. By night, we'd anchor close to shore, surrounded by towering pines and the eerie stillness of the wilderness. That evening, we had just settled in for the night. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. I decided to take one last swim before it got too dark. The water was cool against my skin as I glided through it, making my way along the shore, enjoying the peaceful solitude. As I reached a spot just past the boat, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just another tree, but then I saw it, a man, standing at the edge of the forest, partially hidden by the shadows. He wasn't just standing there, though. He was watching me, and his hand was moving in a way that sent a cold wave of fear and disgust through me. He was masturbating, his eyes locked on me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't want him to know I'd seen him. The last thing I wanted was to draw his attention any more than it already was. Slowly, I ducked under the water, my lungs burning as I swam as fast as I could back to the boat, hoping he hadn't seen my reaction. When I surfaced near the boat, I was trembling. My mind raced, but I couldn't let my family see my fear, not yet. I quickly climbed back on board, trying to keep my voice steady as I suggested we move the boat. I made up some excuse about not liking the spot, that it didn't feel right. They were annoyed, but they agreed. I could feel his eyes on me, even as we pulled up the anchor and moved to another part of the lake. But the feeling didn't leave. Every time we anchored after that, I'd stare at the dark tree line, convinced he was there, hiding, watching. The image of him standing in the shadows, doing that vile thing, stayed with me. Even when we moved far from that spot, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to appear again. The trip was supposed to be a celebration, but after that night, the lake wasn't the same. The dark water that had once felt cool and refreshing now seemed to close in around me, suffocating. The tree line that had once been a beautiful backdrop was now a wall of black, hiding who knew what. Every time I looked into those woods, I could see him, standing there, waiting. The rest of the trip passed in a blur. My family was oblivious to the change in me, chalking it up to a bad mood or just the usual sibling tensions. But I knew it was something deeper, something darker. When we finally returned home, I felt a sense of relief, but the unease never truly left. The memory of that man haunted me long after the trip was over, a dark shadow over what should have been a happy time. I've tried to forget, tried to push the memory to the back of my mind, but every now and then, it creeps back in. I'll see a dark forest, or hear the sound of water lapping against the shore, and I'll be back there, on that lake, feeling his eyes on me. It's a feeling I can't shake, a reminder that sometimes, even in the most beautiful places, something dark is lurking just out of sight, waiting.